In this session, we're going to talk about how to speed read law school cases. And I just want to start by saying what you're going to hear in this session will probably contradict what you hear from some of your friends or mentors or law school professors. And the reason is I'm going to tell you to pay an appropriate amount of attention to cases. A lot of people will say you want to read every word of every case, or you want to brief every single case. I've heard people say in law school, I briefed cases from day one of law school till my last day of law school, every single case I was assigned. And I think of, wow, that's a lot of time you wasted. Okay, so what I'm going to teach you is how to pay an appropriate amount of attention to cases. Because if you read every single word of every case, and then you brief every single case, and then you join a study group and you talk about the facts of the cases, and then you prepare to be on call super well so you can answer questions about the cases, you're going to be spending all of your time on that. And law school exams don't test cases. They test whether you know the law and whether you can apply it. So if you're spending all of your time reading cases and briefing cases and talking about cases and preparing to answer questions about cases, you're not going to have a lot of time to outline, learn your outlines, learn the Iraq taking exam strategy, and practice it. There's just not enough time in a day. And inevitably, law students who prioritize cases, all of this other stuff falls through the cracks, and then they end up scrambling close to exam time, and they just don't do that well on their final exams, even though they've worked really hard. And that's because they're working hard at things that aren't going to get them a high grade. So instead of wasting your time over focusing on cases, what you want to do is spend an appropriate amount of time on cases. You want to be able to follow along in class, you want to be able to understand the main point of a case, and you want to be able to answer questions if you happen to be called on. But you don't want to go crazy, okay? And that's what I'm going to teach you here. So the first lesson is you want to be able to speed read cases. You want to get through them quickly. And the best way to do that is to use this strategy. First, understand why you're reading a case. And the best thing to do is go to your table of contents in your syllabus, or go to your table of contents in your casebook and look at where the case falls. For example, the case of Tuberville v. Savage, it's under the heading of the intentional tort of assault. And underneath the first heading is intentionally inflicted harms. So you know that you're reading about the intentional tort of assault. And you can tell that just literally by opening your casebook or by looking at your syllabus. So that kind of orients you to where you are. The second thing that you want to do is read a case brief. A case brief is going to tell you what happened. It's basically a summary of the case. It's going to tell you the facts. It's going to tell you the holding. It's going to tell you the rationale. So if you read the case brief, you're primed. You already know exactly what's happening in the case. So this is going to make reading the case really fast because you already know what's going to happen. So an example, you can see the Tuberville v. Savage case brief here. It says the facts, the issue, the rule of law, the holding, and the rationale. Just by taking 30 seconds to read this, you already know what's going to happen in the case. Then you can quickly read the case. So you can take a highlighter and highlight things like the issue. Here the issue is highlighted in green. The rule. Here the rule's in orange. Okay, the conclusion or the holding that's in blue. So you can highlight all of these things in your case brief, or just take really brief notes on the side of your case. And that way, you still have looked at your case book, you've read the case very quickly, and you still have notes. So if you're called on, if the professor says something like what's the holding or what's the rationale, you can find it in your case book really quickly. One thing to keep in mind is that there are some things that you do not want to do. And these are honestly mistakes that I made or that we see our students make. So please keep this in mind because it'll make you much more productive if you keep it in mind at the beginning of the semester. The first is don't pre-read cases. I used to try to do this. I'd hate cases. I want to get them all over with on the weekend. But the problem is if you read them all on the weekend, especially using this method, you're going to forget them by the time you get to class. You're going to have no idea. If you have a Thursday class and you read that case on Sunday, you're reading so many cases and you're doing so much that you will forget what happened. So the best thing to do is to read them as close to class as possible. Either get up early and read them the morning that you have class, or read them the night before. And that way they'll be fresh in your mind for class. So that's my first important tip on what not to do. Don't try to pre-read cases. Second, don't get hung up on every vocabulary word. Don't get hung up on procedural history, like what level is this at? Is that at the appellate level or the Supreme Court level or whatever? It really doesn't matter unless you're in a civil procedure class. Okay, so don't get hung up on the nuances and the details. If there's a nuance or detail that's important, your professor will cover it in class. Don't worry about it too much when you're just reading the case. Third, don't brief cases separately and don't take detailed notes on cases on like a separate notepad or on your laptop. This is way too time consuming. Cases are just illustrations of the law. It's like when you did math and you had story problems, okay, in school. You wouldn't memorize the story problems. The story problem is just an example of how to apply that mathematical principle. It's the principle that you'd want to learn. And that's the same thing with cases. Cases will just illustrate the law. But it's not that you want to memorize the cases. You don't need to know the story. You don't need to know any of that. You just need to know the rule of law because the cases will illustrate these principles. So don't brief cases separately or take detailed notes. This is extremely time consuming, especially to brief every case. And again, it just won't help you on the final exam. Don't be too hard on yourself. Be patient, especially in the beginning. You're going to want to spend a little bit more time in your casebook the first week of law school, for example, because it's so new. So don't be too hard on yourself or get too frustrated with yourself, especially if things are taking longer than you want them to. And then next, limit the time that you spend reading cases. Since cases do not necessarily lead at all to a high class rank, you can know the cases really well and not do well in law school. You want to make sure that you're limiting the time that you spend reading them. Like what I would do, and we're going to be talking about this more in this course, but I would have a law school study schedule essentially, and every day I would outline, I would review my outlines, I would practice as I rack taking strategy on practice exams or in problems and supplements, and then the very last thing on my list was read cases. So I naturally would limit the time I spent on them because I'd only have an hour at the end of the day to read all my cases. So I'm not going to spend more than an hour on it. It's all the time I have left. So you want to prioritize the other things and limit the time you spend on cases, and you will necessarily become more efficient and productive as you go along.